Citizen Kane is the most important, greatest American film as far as I'm concerned.
This is the gold standard here.
It's pretty hard to top Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane is the greatest movie ever made.
That Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever made has become a kind of universal truth, endorsed by critics and filmmakers alike. Now, whether it really is the greatest, I wouldn't be able to say. I don't think anyone could. But what I'd like to do is explore some of the things which may have helped it earn its title. So first of all, what's Citizen Kane about? Well, the answer isn't that simple. On the one hand, it's about a guy who's separated from his parents, inherits a lot of money, becomes a media mogul, gets married once, tries to dabble in politics, fails, gets married again, builds a crazy mansion, and dies alone. In other words, a classic rise and fall. But how is this story told? Well, first we see Kane die, then we see a fake newsreel about his life, and for nearly all the rest of the film, we follow a journalist investigating Kane's mysterious last words. So most of the film is comprised of different people's memories of Kane, memories which are subjective. The only time we have a seemingly objective view of Kane is in the very first sequence when he says, Rosebud. This way of telling a story through flashbacks was already quite unusual in Hollywood dramas at the time. But what was even more unusual were the different cinematic techniques that Orson Welles used. For example, the incredible tracking shot that goes from a poster of Kane's second wife through the neon sign and then through an overhead window before settling at ground level. Welles was probably very proud of this one because he does it a second time later on. Or the amazing deep focus photography that allows the foreground and background to remain sharp. Or the stunning use of contrast between light and shadow that makes the scenes incredibly dramatic. Or when the film transitions seamlessly from a photograph to the time it was taken, or how we're shown a house in the snow before panning back to see it's actually in a glass ball, before seeing the next shot reflected through the same glass ball. The list could go on. Citizen Kane is a very stylized film, but to me what makes it so great is not how innovative it was from a technical or narrative point of view, it's how the style expresses the themes that are explored in the story. So, to answer that, let's start at the very beginning. The opening shot of Citizen Kane is a sign that says, no trespassing, which is interesting because throughout the whole film, we're going to be doing a lot of trespassing. First of all, by entering Kane's house, just after we were told not to. People often think the last shot of the film is Rosebud burning, but actually it's the no trespassing sign which comes back at the very end. So this idea of trespassing is definitely important. And I think it gives the viewer a sense of power, of ubiquity. Regular people aren't allowed to trespass, but I am going to be allowed to penetrate the dark corners of Xanadu all by watching a few fades from the comfort of a chair. There are also several moments in the film where the door closes on the camera and then, as if by magic, the camera passes through. So we get the impression we're going to be able to discover hidden secrets. At the end of the film, we're the only ones that see Rosebud burning and so are able to understand its significance. This makes the final realization all the more powerful because it makes us feel powerful for seeing what the characters didn't. But do we really see everything? Well, I mentioned earlier the beautiful use of light and shadow in the film, but it isn't only beautiful, it's also meaningful. It can help make a contrast between a character who is speaking out openly and honestly and a character who is struggling with his inner demons, like in this scene between Kane and his second wife, Susan Alexander. Characters often come in and out of shadows during scenes, which can have a dramatic effect. For example, in the scene where Kane's first wife has found out about his affair and has cornered him and his soon-to-be second wife. The characters in the foreground are talking about Kane, and Kane is silent. He's also in the background and in the shadow. This shot has a very important parallel with an earlier shot where Kane's parents and Mr. Thatcher are both discussing his future and he is in the background playing in the snow, not realizing what is going on.
I don't hold with signing my boy away to any banker's guardian.
I want you to stop.
This time, he comes out of the background and into the light to make a life-changing decision.
I'm staying here.
Now, it may look cheesy and grandiose at first glance, but it's also very ironic because this particular decision will mark the beginning of his downfall. And secondly, the fact that he is in the shadow when he ponders his decision and comes into the light when he makes it is also extremely important because it reflects a general theme in the film. We don't exactly know what motivates Kane's decisions. All we have are his actions and their results. The rest stays in the dark. The parallel with the childhood scene hints at something, but it can't do more than that. And lastly, this shot is also very significant because our eyes don't know where to look. Our attention is not directed to one specific place in the shot because the characters that are speaking are on the sides, and the character in the middle, who is also the main character in the film, is in the shadow and he doesn't speak for a long while.
What about me?
So even in scenes where Kane is present, we don't have full access to him. The camera can go through windows and doors, it can plunge into your character's memories of Kane, but does it really manage to shine a light on who he was, even with the final revelation? Well, the viewer often latches onto Rosebud as an explanation of who Kane really was. But just before the journalist says,
I don't think any word can explain a man's life.
now you can interpret this in two ways. Either it's just the journalist who has abandoned his quest and pretends that it was meaningless in the first place, so that when we see the final revelation, the irony is on him because that's the answer to the question he's been asking throughout the whole film. But you can also see it as a warning to us viewers, as in, don't let yourself be manipulated by what we're just about to show. Another warning is that this whole quest for an explanation of Kane is given by a media manager to a journalist.
Rosebud, dead or alive?
And one major narrative in the film is how Kane bends the truth to give people what they want to hear and sell a lot of newspapers. As he himself says,
If the headline is big enough, it makes the news big enough.
so when his death itself becomes big news and makes big headlines, shouldn't we be skeptical of an explanation to his life, be it Rosebud or anything else? The Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges once said, referring to Citizen Kane, that nothing is so frightening as a labyrinth without a center. This film is precisely that labyrinth. Citizen Kane the film and Citizen Kane the character are both labyrinths reflecting each other, and Xanadu comes to represent this labyrinth physically, a labyrinth which we are warned not to penetrate. So for all its technical brilliance, Citizen Kane also points to one of cinema's shortcomings, its inability to represent the essence of a person, even a fictional one. In the end, Kane remains a mystery, a puzzle, a series of reflecting mirrors where the more important thing is not who he was, but how people see him. The title of the film is not Charles Foster Kane, but Citizen Kane, which shows that it's not so much about Charles Foster Kane as one self-containing person, but about how he relates to a group, whether that group is American society, the people who actually knew him, or ultimately us viewers. We fill the gaps in between fragments in order to reconstruct a full picture, and our opinion of Kane, whether he's a fascist, a cynic, a sentimentalist, a romantic, a buffoon, a tired old man, a child at heart, or even just a boring character, says more about us than about him. We can look at what we want in a shot, and we can choose how we want to see it, and that's a great example of what cinema can be at its best. By giving us enough freedom, it forces us to put a bit of ourselves into how we're going to understand a film, and in doing so, it helps us understand ourselves.